thank you to the working group for inviting me here today for this really important event. I've been following along on YouTube, and I can see that everybody's really engaged, so that's wonderful. I really admire the group for confronting these misconceptions around alcohol consumption and harms, and the group's commitment to understanding the impacts of evidence-based solutions is really great and going to be a strength of this work for sure. So, sorry, did you introduce the first myth, or should I turn it back over to you, Maria?
You can just start with the first myth.
Okay.
I can
Sure,
say it in
thank
Greenlandic. That's myth number 1. Go ahead.
So first, to tackle this myth, we need to consider what we mean by a few drinks. And Karina mentioned yesterday that 2 factors, the volume and the pattern of drinking, determine the harm from alcohol. So we need to consider how many drinks and how often. And then we need to define what we mean by harms. Which harms? The risk of harm from alcohol differs depending on the type of harm, whether it be cancer, heart disease, acute injury, violence, etc. And let's move to the next slide, please.
Yeah.
Great. So if we look at the research evidence, we see which types of harms are actually associated with alcohol use, even at very low levels or just a few drinks, as we say. So on the screen is the guidance from the Alcohol and Health, Canadian guidance for alcohol and health that Adam mentioned yesterday. And this guidance is based on over 400 studies, included millions of participants for most conditions. Risk of developing about 20 different disease conditions at different levels of alcohol consumption. And what they found was that no drinking is the safest option and may even offer some benefits. 1 to 2 drinks per week, you're likely to avoid most alcohol-related consequences. But once we start reaching the level of 2 drinks on one occasion or one day, we see an association with an increased risk of injuries and violence. And then 3 to 6 drinks per week, the risk of developing several types of cancer, like breast cancer, colon cancer, starts to increase. And at 7 or more drinks, your risk of heart disease and stroke starts to increase significantly. Next slide, please. So if we look at the risk curves that were the basis for these recommendations, and we look at some of the conditions, we see that, for example, starts to increase quite dramatically, even at lower levels of consumption, while the risk for other conditions such as heart disease from high blood pressure starts to increase at slightly higher levels of consumption. And under each graph, I've put the list of conditions that follows roughly a similar risk pattern. And you'll see for that first group, where the risk starts at relatively low levels of consumption, there's a whole range of harms. So several types of cancer, infectious diseases like tuberculosis, high blood pressure, liver cirrhosis, the list goes on. And these findings are based on rigorous scientific methods and clearly demonstrate that even drinking at lower levels or a few drinks could lead to serious health impacts. Thanks, Maria.
Oh. I will just summarize it in Greenlandic. This aalakoornartortalik imertarfiit marlussunguit uannik ajoqusiinaviangillamik oqartarneq imigassaq aalakoornartortalimmik atassutеqartumik ajoqusernисsamik aarlerinaat annikitsunguamilluuniit imigassaq aalakoornartortalimmik imeqaluaraani qaffariaateqartarnera eqqarsaatigineqanngitsoq inuup imigassaq aalakoornartortalimmik imertarnera suli akulikinnerusu tillugu ajoqusernисsamут aarlerinaat suli annertunerulersarpoq amerlasuut immaqa isumaqartarput imigassaq aalakoornartortalimmik annikitsumik imertarneq uloriartuungitsoq kisianni imigassaq aalakoornartortalimmik tas imiaqamik ullormut marlunnit amerlanerusuni sunik imaluunniit sapaatipakunneranut pingasunik amerlanerusunik imigaqartaruit taava tamanna peqqissuttinnut isumannaatuunis sannullu aarlerinartorsiortitsinerulersarpoq. Yeah. Let's move on to myth number 2. And I will just say it in Greenlandic. Imigassaqtorpallaartut ааллутииннарсинаангиннатсигит соор илааса имигассартор торнертик aqussinnaangimmassuk амерланеруссут теқартут пиллассавагут. Yeah, Ashley.
Thank you.
So I'll just
number 2.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Ja. Just move.
Perfect.
Jeg vil bare have hende lidt ned. Sådan.
So this view is one that's often perpetuated by the alcohol industry. The idea that alcohol problems are confined to a specific group of individuals who drink excessively is not accurate and can be quite stigmatizing, actually. So as we just discussed, the threshold for drinking too much and experiencing harm or causing harm from alcohol is actually quite low. It's not just individuals who drink heavily or who engage in binge drinking who experience harm from alcohol use. Individuals who drink regularly or at lower levels are also at risk for a range of harms. And if we look at the distribution of alcohol consumption in a population here on the slide, where X is the cutoff for what we'll call heavy drinking, and A is average consumption, we see that the heavy drinkers in that red section is actually a relatively small proportion of the population. And depending on the outcome or the harm that we're talking about, those people with the smaller risk in the whole population, so in that gray area, contribute more alcohol attributable disease and mortality than those with the higher risk, simply because they represent a greater proportion of the population. So if we focus only on the heavy drinkers, we'll miss an opportunity to prevent harms and deaths amongst all levels of drinkers, including those who consume at lower levels but may still be at risk for experiencing the harms. It's because population level policies target all drinkers that is what makes them successful in mitigating more harm than if we had only targeted, say, binge drinkers. Broader public health strategies that regulate alcohol sales are not about punishing the masses. They're really about tackling the root causes and creating a safer environment. And the environmental piece is key, an environment that minimizes harm for everyone without stigmatizing a particular group. So really it's about balancing the needs of the whole community with the goal of minimizing harm. Okay. So why can't we just focus on information, education, and treatment to change drinking habits? This is a very good question, because often the first solutions that come to mind when we speak about alcohol problems are education and treatment. And these two measures are targeted interventions, and they're often promoted widely by the alcohol industry in public campaigns and their lobbying. And they're targeted because they place the onus on the individual to make the change to improve their health. We give them the information and we expect them to change, or they participate in treatment and the onus is on them to make the change, rather than address the systemic factors that are influencing the drinking in the population more broadly. While information about the risks of alcohol consumption plays a very important role in a comprehensive approach to addressing alcohol harms, when it's implemented on its own, it's actually one of the less effective interventions, and it's not sufficient on its own to change behavior. Research shows that even when people are aware of the risks associated with alcohol use, that may not translate into a change in their drinking habits in any significant way or for a sustained amount of time, without having additional measures to support them in making those changes. Besides knowing the risks, other factors are at play, such as price, convenience, social harms that influence people's decisions to drink. This type of behavioral change often requires a combination of strategies, including education, as well as broader population level policy interventions to bring about that change in habit. In terms of treatment, now there's no doubt treatment is essential for those who need it. However, not everyone who would benefit from treatment has access or seeks treatment. And this segment of the population also represents a relatively small proportion of the population. The majority of the population drinks below these levels and yet are still at risk for a range of harms. So while treatment is important for those who meet the criteria, population level policies can help prevent the problems before we get there, before they require treatment, thereby reducing the overall burden on the healthcare systems. So while education and treatment provide the tools for individuals to make healthier choices, we should think of the broad population level policies as a way to help create an environment that supports these choices, so supports the use of these tools. Amongst the most effective population level measures are the 3 WHO Best Buy policies. And we heard about these yesterday, and we're going to hear more about them today. These policies are higher prices, advertising bans, and availability controls, things like reduced hours and days of sale. And not only are these 3 policy measures amongst the most effective, they're also cost effective and feasible to implement. This is really important. So first, to address this myth, there's a wide range of policy measures or restrictions that could be implemented as part of a national alcohol strategy. So to lump them all together, generally speaking, these measures are designed to balance personal freedom with public welfare and create an environment where people are supported in making an informed choice to protect their health and others in the community. The list of possible restrictions does include a full ban on alcohol, which can be very effective if supported by the large majority. But aside from bans and minimum age laws, controls on alcohol sales don't limit the ability for an individual to choose whether or not to consume alcohol, but rather they regulate the environment in which that choice is made. And this is not unlike other types of regulations, like speed limits or seatbelt laws that help people drive safely and mitigate possible harms while doing that activity. If we consider some of the policies I've mentioned already, we'll see that price is an important factor that influences people's purchasing decisions. The affordability of alcohol can be influenced through taxation, for example, and this is not unique to alcohol. People choose freely to purchase or not purchase certain items based on price on a daily basis. Alcohol advertising, we know, has a strong influence on social norms and increases consumption amongst those who are exposed, particularly amongst youth and younger drinkers. And a ban on alcohol advertising supports individuals to make a free choice without being unduly influenced by highly targeted and persuasive marketing strategies put out by the alcohol industry. Requiring alcohol products to be labeled with specific warning messages or alcohol guidance, like we saw in the risk zones, is sometimes conflated with imposing a what we call a nanny state approach, so a governmental attempt to control people's behavior. But shows that people are not aware of the risks associated with alcohol use, particularly the cancer risk that I showed earlier on the risk curves. Implementing labeling components addresses people's right to know the risks associated with alcohol use and empowers them with the necessary information so that individuals can make an informed choice about their alcohol use. Ability controls regulates the times and the locations where alcohol can be purchased or consumed to reduce harms in particularly high-risk settings. For example, reducing late-night sales leads to decreased incidents of alcohol-related violence, accidents, harms to others. Restricting sales around schools leads to lower rates of alcohol consumption amongst youth. And so these measures, they don't eliminate the ability to choose to consume alcohol, but rather they alter the convenience of alcohol purchases, and they're a way of encouraging individuals to plan their purchases or their consumption. So overall, alcohol policy measures don't restrict individuals' choice, rather they shape the alcohol environment in ways that support and empower individuals to make informed decisions to protect their health and their community. So this actually really isn't an unreasonable assumption to make. This is a widely held belief. We see it perpetuated in the media often when increased restrictions are announced, particularly in Canada. These policies may not bring about a noticeable change in the drinking of every individual, but they do impact consumption at the population level. And that's how we need to think of this as a population level change, because we're talking about population level policies. So if you remember, if we can go to the next slide, if you remember the consumption curve that I showed earlier that looked like this, well, these policies that we're talking about, they shift that curve and they shift it to the left to lower consumption levels. And what happens is everyone moves on that curve together so that there are fewer heavy drinkers in that red zone and lower rates of consumption and harm amongst everyone in the population as they shift. And when we looked at the relative risk curves for cancer and heart disease earlier, we saw that even small incremental changes in consumption can lead to dramatic changes in risk, especially for those already drinking at higher levels, so on the right side of those risk curves. So while these changes aren't always noticeable at the individual level, they have significant effects at the population level. If we can move to the next slide, please. Research shows that the Best Buy policies do have a significant impact on drinking behavior, which we then often see translated into reduced alcohol harms. So some examples of this: in a community in Tennant Creek, Australia, Aboriginal groups successfully lobbied for restrictions on payday alcohol sales, specifically restrictions on large container sizes, so large 4-liter casks of wine, and restrictions for takeaway sales in terms of the hours that takeaway sales were permitted. These policies, known as the Thirsty Thursday policy, was associated with a reduction in alcohol-related police incidents, hospital admissions, and women's shelter presentations. And during the same period of time, alcohol consumption decreased by 19%. More recently, a reduction in hours in sales in Lithuania of 4 hours per day and 9 hours on Sundays affected patterns of alcohol-related deaths amongst men throughout the week. So findings showed that after these hours were reduced, the high number of deaths from alcohol-related causes that typically peaked on Sundays decreased, and we saw a similar shift to the patterns of death on Mondays also improved or also decreased. So while individuals might not notice such changes in their personal consumption, these cumulative effects at the population level can be quite impactful in terms of reducing harms and costs to society more broadly. It's not unusual to have these myths perpetuated in the media or by different economic actors or members of the industry. And so it's important that they're tackled. There may be more that emerge as you move through this work. I'm happy to engage with all of you to tackle the myths as they arise and ensure that everyone has the evidence-based information they need for the success of this work. So thank you very much for having me here today to discuss this with you, all of you.
Thank you so much, Ashley.